Welcome, everybody, after a whirlwind week and in Victoria Falls at the ZNCC Congress. We were unfortunate not to air on Friday, but we decided we'd do this on a Saturday. And we're back in Harare.
Yeah, and it's all Ranga's fault because he's away and he's in charge of production, and it was a mess.
Well, there we go. But how was the trip?
No, it was good fun. You know, it's always a pleasure to spend time in that majestic city and be away from Harare. You know, it's just lots of fresh air, looking at lots of water. And it's a different vibe. Yeah, it's a completely different vibe. So,
what are you having?
Yeah, this is a gift from the US ambassador from our last show. So I finally get around to participating in some of this iconic American whiskey. And you sound like you've got a flu. What are you? How did you manage that? Yeah.
Well, I shall not go into the details, but it was unfortunate, but here we are. So I'm having the Kazi tree from Bangladesh, and it's the green tea. Let's see how it goes on a Saturday.
Or maybe you'll get maybe you'll get all sorts of elixirs from your fans to help you get better soon.
Well, I know exactly what to do to get better soon.
Okay.
But yeah, I should be back to normal on Monday.
Awesome. Well, I wish you a very speedy recovery.
Oh, thank
These
you very
flus
much.
can be quite awful. Wouldn't wish them on anyone.
They are. But suffice it to say, hotel rooms should never have, carpets that have not been changed in a very long time.
You had a rather unpleasant experience, didn't you?
But anyway, tell us a bit about the Congress.
Well, it's the ZNCC annual Congress. The ZNCC is the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, and I think this year's theme was around partnerships with and policy with the policymaker and unlocking productivity. We moderated a bunch of panels. There were some other presentations and discussions. I think it was very they were very vibrant discussions. Mm-hmm. I think people were quite honest. And the conference was obviously graced by the vice president, and he also, made what I think were interesting submissions. So
let's actually get into the weeds of that. What
on your panel you discussed corruption, and he actually spoke to it as well. That it's something that needs to.
Well, what's your take on it? I mean, what's this whole idea of corruption? Is it such a big thing? I mean, we saw the U.S. ambassador, she came here and she spoke about corruption, and we hearing the vice president speaking about corruption. Lots of people have been talking about corruption, about who's more corrupt than the other person. So clearly, in our lexicon, corruption has entered in a big way, and let's actually talk about it, and let's talk about corruption from an economic perspective. What are the disadvantages, and what are the costs of corruption, and what does it actually mean in a free market economy? So corruption under a communist or socialist environment and under a free market economy, would we have corruption?
Yeah, so I actually think that to the extent that the corruption is a problem at all in our country, it's more a function of, it's a symptom of a policy framework that has, that makes it extremely difficult to do business, right? So, we've got, I think our markets across the board are overregulated. So the bureaucrats in charge of moving things along, approvals, are much more powerful than they ought to be in a free market, and this is what engenders the corruption. Because to get anything done, you have to actually bribe bureaucrats, and the regulatory framework is so convoluted. It creates this opacity that makes it possible to do corrupt transactions on at a scale that's probably much harder in a much more open free market society. So I think it's more a symptom of a policy framework that's much less than ideal than it is a primary problem in the economy. So I think so. For example, if you got rid of exchange control, if you got rid of a lot of unnecessary regulations, I think the corruption you would get rid of a lot of corruption, just as a side effect, and it will be just.
So, are you saying that corruption is a result or a byproduct of over-regulation?
Yes, it's a byproduct of overregulation and not just overregulation, but a policy framework that is unpredictable. So one of the other challenges that we have in our country is that we're constantly chopping and changing the policies. So
so you have to get ahead of the game.
Absolutely, you can't you can't plan 5, 10, 15 years And so the only way that you can be ahead of unpleasant surprises is if you then create these unhealthy relationships with policymakers where you're always ahead of the curve. And those who have of high integrity can't compete, right? So if you think about it from the perspective of one of the bigger sectors in the country, mining, right? You have a particular class of investors that have that seem to have access to the political class and are quite happy to deploy significant amounts of capital, and then the global mining majors who don't play that game just aren't interested, and you don't see their presence. Yeah. So but you actually moderated a panel in which corruption was one of the issues. What were your takeaways? Because you obviously had an opinion about corruption ahead of this conference, and then you learned a whole bunch of things, or you gleaned some insights.
Well, the sense I got is the authorities are extremely defensive. Mm-hmm. So when confronted with these issues, they seem very, very defensive. That's number one. And number two, I think that they live in a world or in an alternative universe to every one of us, and I don't think that actually engenders the sort of environment that you would want to see, which is, far less corruption than there is. I think they seem to be, they seem to be taking the view that it's very difficult to prove corruption, which is also very true around the world. It tends to be very difficult to actually prove corrupt practices. But I think that's why the regulation and the system and the regulatory environment and the market system plays in to actually curb the likelihood of corrupt practices. Mm-hmm. So yes, you cannot prove that so-and-so was corrupt, but what are you doing to improve the system? Mm-hmm. And that should actually be part of your remit. So if you're Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, part of your remit is to ensure that you can curb the likelihood of corruption. And then you can actually show us and say, guys, if I wasn't there, these are the practices or corrupt practices that would have happened. But because of us, we've actually stopped corruption. Similarly, should be true of the police force as well, that this is what we've done to ensure that we actually curb corruption. And I think from a regulatory perspective, I think what comes out, and I'll go just beyond what you've just talked about, which is really policy uncertainty. But I would go as far as saying that you obviously, if you have a government, by its very nature, it's prone to corruption because you've got these toll gates that are totally unnecessary. Mm-hmm. So if you remove the toll gates, by definition, you remove the corruption. Yep. So if you look at a lot of the service provisions that we need from government, we don't necessarily need government in that space. And if you remove government in that space and you allow the free market to participate, or free market participants to come in and to provide the goods directly to the consumer, then you don't need these special vehicles and special contracts with certain individuals that then dominate. And I think that the often used excuse is Elon Musk, supplies government, and somewhat that is corrupt. But what people don't realize is that Elon Musk, or a lot of people who supply, government contracts in America, it's minuscule compared to, the economy of America. You're talking about an economy that is, almost 30 trillion. And, government tenders are less than 1 trillion a year, and what Elon Musk is getting. So even if it was done so as a political favor, it's very minuscule compared to the American economy. And nobody cares. You have people who do not care whether or not they supply government, because government it's not the primary driver of an economy. Ideally, in a free market economy, the economy is driven by consumers. You must be supplying products to the consumer and not to government. And here we have an inverse relationship where, if you don't supply to government, then you're not in business, or it's seen to be that way. And I think that that's already problematic.
Yeah. And
so I think a smaller government would certainly curb corruption and corrupt practices by its very definition.
Absolutely. And also just, there's just, in terms of supplying goods and services to the state, this whole tenders and tenderpreneurship conversation, I think some practices are better than others. So, for example, in South Africa, when the state puts out a tender, people who want to supply the government make applications, and then those applications are reviewed and a winner is announced. And one of the things that they do down there that enhances transparency and builds trust and confidence in the process is that they publish the details of all the tenders, right? So if you were competing for a tender and you lost, and you believe that your bid was the best bid, you can actually then review all the other competing bids and sue the state if
Zimbabwe actually allows that. Zimbabwe actually allows that. The problem in Zimbabwe is a lot of these contracts are being done outside of the tender system. That's actually part of our problem. Yeah, that take Command Agriculture, where somebody is just directly given the contract. We've got numerous examples where someone is just given directly a contract and it doesn't go through the tender system, tender process.
Okay.
And I think that we had PRAS, and they came out very scathing.
PRAS, for the benefit of the audience.
Procurement. It was something about government, the
regulator. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's like, you know what? We're online. We've got all the principles and everything that you need to go through, and there's a good robust system that's actually there.
Okay.
But if a tender is given to somebody, or a contract is given to somebody, and it's outside of their purview, then they've got absolutely nothing to do. And to be fair, you can't blame whoever is the recipient of the contract, right? Mm-hmm. I can't say, whatever, why did you get that? Really, my concern should be the processes. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we had the correct processes, then we should be able to at least ameliorate the occurrence of corruption. We've seen that again with Mutapa, right? Where there's a law, or it was an SI, where certain things cannot go through tender. I mean, why would you do that?
No. That I can defend or understand. The whole point of
defend it. Let me hear this.
Because it's you've moved all of these failing parastatals out of ministries where they'd been basically hemorrhaging the government and taxpayers for decades, and you've created a sovereign wealth fund that is supposed to work on a commercial basis, right? It's supposed to be able to move quickly, make decisions, and so I actually think that it,
So why you still please come round to why they shouldn't go through. They're still government entities. Why shouldn't they go through the tendering process?
No. So basically, you've created a sovereign wealth fund that you have.
Is it a government entity?
It's owned and controlled by the government, but it operates commercially. So
then make it a commercial, make it a private organization. If it's a government organization, and it's reporting directly to the public, then it must go through the public procurement and tendering process. Why should they go outside of it?
Because they are hamstrung.
If the problem is the process, then let's refine the process right across. There shouldn't be a special class of organizations that don't go through the public procurement process.
But I think that for a commercial operation, and I think you can understand this if you put on your hat as an entrepreneur in terms of your capacity to make decisions quickly and adapt to a dynamic market, right? You don't want to be hemorrhaged. You don't want to be handicapped by a tender process, right? So I believe for the Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's got a different governance structure, right? Where it has this holding company board that is populated by highly credentialed individuals, and it's got a governance structure that I think is fit for purpose for the portfolio that it has. Well, will it work? Will we get the outcomes that we,
Okay, I need to push back.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the whole
you
point.
Create a layer.
The cat's away, so we get to play.
We call this the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but you create another layer of bureaucratic processes, because when the parastatal didn't have a head office ahead of it, it would go through its own processes. But now you create another layer of bureaucratic processes. And once you've created another layer of bureaucratic processes, you then come back to us and you tell us but that layer of bureaucratic processes is allowed to quicken things and to get around the tendering process that the original entity is not allowed to. And you think that that's progress?
Yeah, so look, I look at it a little bit differently. So I'll take Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway as the gold standard, right? So let me make my case, and then you can critique it. Okay. So,
but I wanted. But let's stick to public enterprises.
Yes. So I'm saying that the model, right, or the inspiration for the Mutapa model was never private sector. It's not public sector.
No, the inspiration was the Norwegian and the Swedish Sovereign Wealth Fund. It wasn't Warren Buffett.
No. I know, but I want to make a useful analogy, because I'm saying.
All right. Go ahead. Let's hear it.
Because in terms of managing any investment, I think Warren Buffett. We can agree. It's not controversial, right? That over the last 60 years, the gold standard in terms of managing money consistently over 6 decades is Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. And Warren Buffett runs this behemoth out of Omaha in an office with just 25 people, right? And a lot of people don't understand or aren't aware, but Berkshire Hathaway is actually a conglomerate that has circa 300 subsidiaries, right? Like, very different businesses, from a company that makes sweets to a company that makes running shoes to newspapers to all sorts of things, right? So it is actually possible to run a big conglomerate with a head office or holding company structure in a very lean and efficient way, and without going through a procurement process akin to what governments have, right? And still create a lot of value, right? So I think so we have a real world example of a holding company with lots of subsidiaries that is run very well over a long period of time. So we know that it's doable.
No,
the question is whether.
But your example is actually out of kilter with the reality.
Okay.
So Warren Buffett is an investor. It's not a holdings company.
Well, Berkshire Hathaway is a holding company that owns all these other companies, right?
Yeah, but they invest. The holdings company, Apple, they have shares in Apple.
No.
Apple,
So this is what I'm saying is not well known, right? So they have investments where they're passive, like their shareholding in Apple or Coca-Cola and some of these banks. But they also own companies 100%. Like circa 300 subsidiaries and that they own 100%.
It's a private entity. Okay,
yeah.
So the point that we want to make very clear is it's a private entity.
Yes.
Right? And where they hold their largest shares, Apple, Microsoft, they run their businesses as separate entities. Mm-hmm. And they do not even go to Warren Buffett for any advice whatsoever. It's Warren Buffett who is investing in the management and is allowing the management to run the company. Mm-hmm. But I think that's actually besides the point, because that's not what we're debating here. We're debating, first of all, the Mutapa Sovereign Wealth Fund is not operating as a fund. It's operating as a holdings company. Because now all these other entities are reporting to Mutapa. Because ideally they shouldn't report to Mutapa. Mutapa should just purely be an investor. Mm-hmm. Right? And they should really be concerned with how do we disinvest or privatize these entities and allow these entities to actually operate. But what has happened is Mutapa sits there as an extra layer of bureaucracy. And because it's an extra layer of bureaucracy that can go around and circumvent the tendering process, and itself is still a government entity. And I'm saying these special laws are what actually creates and ferments corruption. I'm not saying that, and I'm not making the case that Mutapa is corrupt. Maybe Mutapa is run by excellent professional managers. But when you create these exceptional laws for Mutapa, who's to tell what will happen next time when someone else will create a special law and says, you know what, Mutapa was the exception and we're just following with what Mutapa did. And I am saying that what ZAC should do. So ZAC is not necessarily there to run after.
ZAC, you're talking about the
Zimbabwe
Anti-Corruption Commission.
Yeah. It's not just there to run after the guys who are corrupt. But it's to pick up these laws and say, no. Why does Mutapa have an exception? Yeah, because when you create these exceptional laws,
I hear you.
You're inherently fermenting corruption.
I hear you, but I'll push back a little bit because, and maybe I have a soft spot for the Mutapa structure because the portfolio companies in that fund were sitting in ministries for decades and bleeding the fiscus. It was a ongoing train wreck. So it's actually difficult to imagine a state of affairs that is worse than what prevailed before all of these companies were put into Mutapa, because they were losing money every year, and the state was constantly taking on their debt and funding them. And now you've got this structure where they've been ring-fenced, and it's clear that they're supposed to operate commercially. The state is actually not on the hook for their debts, and they're not going to be issuing guarantees. This is now going to operate commercially. Now, so I think the idea and the aspirations are a significant improvement from the previous status quo.
How's it a significant improvement if you're adding, number one, an extra bureaucratic layer, and then number two, you're making that entity, which is 100% owned by government, these exceptional laws? Like, you're creating, this is fertile ground for corruption. I'm not saying that Mutapa is corrupt, but I'm saying that the exception itself will lead to corruption.
I think
it's only a matter of time before someone else comes up with a. And I don't know why you can't see that.
No. Look, I can see the potential for things to go horribly wrong that you're pointing out, right?
Because we're not discussing anything but
I think
corruption.
I think that it's a double-edged sword. It's kind of like the debate.
No, it's not.
No. It is a double-edged sword. You can. Governance, I think, is a double-edged sword from the perspective that if you are utterly paranoid about the downside risk in terms of corruption, and you create the danger is that you create all these rules and regulations that are like the fable of Gulliver and all the.
Okay, before we get there, let's simplify. What we've just said is very simple and straightforward. We want policy consistency. But you can't have policy consistency if you don't have a standardized policy that cuts right across. Now, it might be bureaucratic and layered with bureaucracy, but creating an extra layer of bureaucracy and think that is progress is actually not. And I totally agree with those who argue that if there's a problem with our bureaucratic processes,
Let's fix them.
Let's fix them. But let's not create exceptions.
Look,
as a principle, never create exceptions, because this is public policy that we're talking about. And they must all report back to the public.
I hear you. If you actually apply your mind to the very idea of a sovereign wealth fund, like, everywhere that, it's actually new. So there weren't any, none of the sovereign wealth funds globally are more than half a century old. So it's an idea that somebody came up with, to deploy a state's capital with an investment and growth mindset. And the reason why it was done outside of your typical government bureaucracy is because that kind of thinking and capital allocation skill set is not something that governments are typically good at, which is why if all those really successful sovereign wealth funds globally, if you look at Norway, if you look at Singapore, if you look at the Saudi fund,
they abide by Norwegian laws. Yeah, they don't have exceptions.
No, actually they do. They were like the laws that actually created them.
Give us an example.
The Norwegian fund, the Singapore fund.
No. Give us an example where they can't go through the same bureaucratic and same
if you actually,
laws.
So, because I've actually spent a bunch of time.
So give us an example.
Looking at the Norwegian fund, right? The guy who runs it like a guy running any hedge fund or private fund, right? He's not subject to the same compliance and governance rules that a minister is subject to.
So you can. So you're saying to us that the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, they've got the similar laws to Mutapa, where they are allowed not to go through a tendering process, where they can short circuit tendering process, and it's perfectly fine. So they don't need to report to the public.
So they do report to the public. They don't go through government tender processes. They are subject to audit. They've got their own governance and compliance, which is commercial, just like BlackRock or Goldman Sachs Asset Management. But they're not subject to the same rules as the government bureaucracy.
No, I think let's make one thing very, very clear. For any body that is created by statute and that is created for public good, it is subject to the laws of that particular country and to public policy rules. But exceptions can be made.
Yes, there are exceptions, right? For sure.
And when you make, the more exceptions you have, the greater the corruption. Just as a principle, as a heuristic, the more exceptions you have, the greater the corruption. And I cannot believe that you think that the Singaporean or the Norwegian or the Swedish, that they've created exceptions. And the second thing that we need to be very clear about is that you keep using this word commercialization. That's not a new word. In fact, commercialization just purely say, in its essence, in its bare essence, just says that an entity cannot go back to the fiscus for its funding. A parastatal,
Yes.
a government parastatal, a government entity cannot go back to the fiscus for its own funding. It must look for its own funding. So that's been true of Zimbabwean parastatals since the 90s. That they don't do it and they still go back to the fiscus.
Yep.
That was never the intention. And just because we've created Mutapa, in fact, Mutapa itself has actually gone to government to get funding from government. And the entities are still going to the fiscus and asking for money from the fiscus. So
Well,
there's
not the
nothing.
entities, but
Yeah. I
Mutapa,
mean, ZESA itself is a lot of those parastatals are still, going ball in hand to the fiscus to actually ask for funding. So let's not introduce words like commercialization as if they're exceptions and special in any way. They're not special in any way. What we want to do is to get to the crux of corruption. And all I'm saying is the minute you create exceptions, never mind the good intentions, never mind that the managers at Mutapa are exceptional and that they're beyond reproach as far as they're concerned as individuals. But the minute you create that allowance and that exception, it means that another entity within the same behemoth of government can also create a little avenue for themselves that is corrupt. And I'm just saying that if I was Zak, that's where I would start. I would say, you know what, it's very difficult to prosecute a lot of these corrupt cases because, well, we just lack of evidence or it just takes a long time. But I could come back to my stakeholders and say, hey, we had 50 laws in our bylaws or in our SIs that were prone to corrupt practices. And we've closed the gap as far as those are concerned. We've streamlined operations. We've made it easier, but we've made it simpler for people to go about their business. And I think that's because we need to be forward looking. That's what we need to be doing more of. We've gone into tender processes. I haven't heard, maybe I'm speaking out of terms, but that's what I would want to hear from Zak. To say we've gone into tender processes and we've back tested every tender process. And it seems to be okay. We give it a green light or an amber or a red. And we are highlighting these things on all the tendering processes. We're not happy with this. We're not happy with this. We've gone into, these exceptions where government entities are given an exception, and we've gone and we've said, you know what, we do not agree with it. And even when we do agree with it, when it's a presidential decree of any sort, we've gone one further and we followed through and said, is Rufaro Incorporated, are they actually the best person? And if we realize that Rufaro Incorporated, and this is what the vice president was talking about, we realize that Rufaro Incorporated was a briefcase operation, then it is our job to raise it and say, you know what, Rufaro, you got this contract, but you have no business in this provision or the provision of this particular good, and we need to come in and stop that. Or if we cannot, at least raise the alarm.
So I hear what you're saying, and I think it's actually quite interesting. If we get into the weeds of it a little bit, if you actually compare governance in the private sector versus the public sector, I would make the case that the governance that you see in a company that's listed on the ZNCC or the Victoria Falls Stock Exchange, or some of these big public interest companies that might not be listed, but they publish their financials, like your tier 1 banks. I would say the governance in that space is much, much better than the governments that you actually see in government. Notwithstanding that in the government, you have this very inefficient and slow bureaucratic process, right? If for procurement, right, which you won't see in a listed company, right? I would bet good money that any of the companies listed on either stock exchange in Zimbabwe has got much better governance than any ministry.
I actually beg to differ.
Because they have to pass audits every year. They have analyst briefings where their management actually speaks to the market and answers questions about what's working and what's not working. Their governance structures tend to be much better.
I actually beg to differ.
You think that the state has better governance than the private sector?
I think that you're making a case. Yeah. I think that you're making the case of maybe 1% of the companies which are listed, which are audited. Most companies are not audited. Most companies are actually not listed. And you find that when you're audited and you're listed, that's governance that's actually imposed upon you.
Yes.
But most companies don't operate that way. But the most important thing, and that's why we believe in free market capitalism, is because most enterprises have a direct feedback loop, which is the customer, right? And the customer and the competition. So because corruption is, you're adding costs to whatever you're doing. And if your competitor is not adding costs, then you're going to be out of business.
Yep.
Right, that's the direct feedback loop. And unfortunately, and that's why governance is more important in public enterprises and why we talk about corruption.
Because governments, the bureaucrat is disconnected from the customer.
Well, not just that, the laws define, regulated monopolies. So no matter what, that regulated monopoly will always be there. So there's no incentive whatsoever to be efficient because you don't have competition. Right, that's number one. Number two, it's the cost adds to the cost of, the taxation. So where you're getting your money from, essentially, let's say GMB, let's say, and here I'm just using GMB as an example. But if GMB, if they had competition and they were corrupt, nobody would just use GMB.
Everybody would use the competition.
They would use the competition. And then GMB would have to correct themselves, despite whatever the governance is, whatever governance issues are. But we create a bureaucratic layer of governance, primarily because we're saying this entity plays a double role, which is not just purely commercially providing a service, but it's a public entity, it's a public utility company that is also answerable to a taxpayer because it's funded by the taxpayer, because it's actually doing a collective public good, which I don't believe in, but let's argue the case through that. If there is a GMB subsidy, eventually it has to be funded by the taxpayer. So you're now answerable not to the customer, not to an investor, but to a taxpayer.
So let me ask you a question with regard to the sovereign wealth fund. It's a thought experiment that I've had that I've played with in my mind for some time. If Mutapa demutualized, right? Because right now it's our wealth fund, but it's the custodian is the government of Zimbabwe, right? Now, what if they woke up one day and they said, "Hey, you know what? Instead of this being in the custody of the government, we're going to issue every citizen a proportionate share, right? And you get a certificate saying you own X percent of Mutapa." Would you want them to go through the same procurement processes that a ministry goes through whenever they want to buy something, or you'd want them to operate like a public listed company?
As long as it's a public entity company, they have to go through the laws.
No. You're not answering my question. I'm saying if you had a share in it,
saying, even if I had a share,
how would you want it to be run?
If I have a share and I am part of the public, then it must go through the collective constitutional requirements. Because
even if it slows it down and it's less nimble and it's less dynamic, and it affects your return.
That's the feedback loop that we want. That's the feedback loop to tell us that we think there's a fundamental problem, but don't create the exception. Then say, hey, if Mutapa is this slow, what more in ZESA? What more in ESM? What more with Harare City Council? So those are the problems that we need to solve. Right.
Okay,
so
fair
I
enough.
don't even believe in. That's why I don't even believe in the sovereign wealth fund as a concept. But I'm just saying that because I live in Zimbabwe, and because I live in a
Why don't you believe with it as a concept?
we can get into
we can get into whatever the producer's not here. So.
No.
Because I'll let you finish. Yeah.
Because we've got a number of things that we want to talk about, and we want to really focus on corruption. But I'm just saying that as long as it's an entity, as long as there's ESM there, right? And I am a shareholder. As long as you're a Zimbabwean, you are already a shareholder. Just because there's a share certificate to say, therefore, you are a shareholder. I mean, it's
there's a difference. If you have a share certificate, maybe you can sell it. So it's so there's a difference.
Well, you can't, right? Because if it's a public entity, then you can't.
No. But if it demutualized, right, and said, listen, we want.
You're not demutualizing. All you're just doing is privatizing.
Yes, privatizing. Yes,
which is fundamentally different. From demutualizing. So what you want to do is you want to privatize, and when you privatize, even if you own the shares, it's going to the fiscus. So there's a litany of work that's been done as far as public policy is concerned. And I know that there are arguments, especially private sector arguments, that say, well, let's take business and put it in government. There's an argument for that. But there's also an argument to just realize that the best we can do as business people when we go into government is to privatize. That should be our aim. Yes, you can make things more efficient, and I think that the principles are true in public sector as well as in private sector. But you must realize that in government you can make mistakes, and there's no feedback loop. In private sector, there is one direct feedback loop. It's the market. The market will punish you. So if you think you're clever, and you think that you don't need to listen to anyone, and that you've figured it all out, the market will tell you whether you're right or wrong. But unfortunately, in public policy, there's no equivalent. So it's very possible in public policy that we could go on for 50 years with the wrong policy.
Well, I mean, it's been since 1965 we've had a bunch of not clever policies.
So it's very possible because there's no feedback loop. And that's why governance becomes more important in public policy. You can't
but
tell
as a
me
libertarian, wouldn't you argue therefore that because of the nature of government, right, the only enduring solution is to have a government that is as small as possible, that is doing as little as possible?
That's what we're arguing. That's what I'm arguing for. That's why I say the whole idea of making exceptional laws for Mutapa is actually besides the point. Because the minute we are under public policy, our only argument is to make it smaller. Not to create exceptions.
With you wholeheartedly.
Not to create exceptions, but it's to just say, you know what?
Life is complicated. Sometimes you have to make exceptions. But I think the ultimate solution is to just have a government that is as small as possible.
And it cuts corruption.
That is just not in our way. And it lets people get about their businesses with as little interference as possible. And I think the challenge that we have, one of the problems that we have in Zimbabwe is that we have philosophically a government that believes they're in the business of solving all our problems.
And then they create layers of bureaucracy and layers of exceptions.
Absolutely.
And that is prone to corruption.
And I think that's the side effect of having a government that's got its tentacles in every aspect of the economy.
Yeah, they should let the market be. And they should realize it's because they don't have a feedback loop. It's very possible to run a thought experiment that is extremely ridiculous. Look, for over 100 years, we've seen it with the NHS, we've seen it with Obamacare.
These look at Zimbabwe over the last 25
experiments
years,
are bad.
We have blown up 2 currencies in 25 years.
Exactly.
That's remarkable. I think, the Hungarians, the Germans, the Argentinians, they've had their monetary crisis, but not at the scale and frequency that we've done
No, I
in the
totally
last,
agree.
Because the Zim dollar in 2008 lost 99.999% of its value until nobody would use it. And the same, and before ZIG, that currency also lost 99% of its value. So this is within a quarter of a century, less than a generation.
ZIG has already lost 66%. In fact, more now. Because I hear the rate is, maybe let's talk about that. But what's actually happening? I hear the rate is above 40.
Well, ZIG is, it's lost a lot of its relevance because I think in as much as, the governor has done well not to print, and over the last 4, 5, 6 months, ZIG has lost market share.
That's not what we're hearing. In fact, they've proved the stats. They've increased the market share.
So
in
really,
their formal market.
Yeah, but
that's
the formal market is losing market share in the economy overall.
Point.
I mean, there was a point where 6 months ago I was very interested in what the power market exchange rate was on a day-to-day basis. Today, I actually don't know what's happening on the power market.
But what's actually happening? Why is the rate moving?
This is news to me. For a lot of people, they've just moved on.
That was the chatter at ZNCC. Let's talk about the 12-day war and what has actually happened with the markets. I mean, we've seen the globally, and your thoughts on that and why the stock market is rallying.
Oh yeah, the global stock market's at an all-time high. So you're talking about the Israeli-Iranian conflict, which the Americans briefly joined in. Look, I think the major concern there was that you would see destruction of Iranian oil infrastructure and a spike in global oil prices, which would just increase the cost of doing business across the world and would just be bad it would be a headwind for the global economy. And it turns out they left this entire fracas did not affect the production of oil in Iran. They seem to be quite mindful about that. And, I think President Trump, to his credit, was quite forceful in bringing the conflict to a close. And it looks like, the threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's oil transits, that's nobody's talking about that anymore. It looks like life is just going to go back to normal.
Do you think that the Iranians are going to play ball?
Oh, they've already played ball. I mean, they over the last 2-3 days, there haven't been any. The ceasefire is held. After
2-3 days.
After
is it time for us to celebrate?
Look. I think I think we can move past that. I don't think it's gonna. I think the incentive for all the players is to move on from this. I could turn out to be wrong, but that's my reading. I think cooler heads will prevail. And
we'll move on to the next crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, I think on that note, it's been a long week for us. Looking forward to next week. But join us. Nobody has the answer. We just wanted to just have a bit of debate with corruption in Zim and whether or not it's a cost. But please do share your comments, like, subscribe, and share the channel to as many people as possible. And let's talk about corruption and what it actually means. I think it's a great thing that we are talking about this scourge.
The sunlight is the best disinfectant,
absolutely,
they say.
Absolutely. But so let's continue the conversation. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful weekend. Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah, I was just